This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Jamal.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, we have a great show today. In fact, a number of the stories are very disturbing. We're going to be talking about a recent declassified Israeli document that revealed fresh and painful details of a planned basically community murder and massacre of Palestinian civilians in Kafr Qasem, which was a real tragic, legendary massacre that the Israeli commandos committed against Palestinian civilians. And I'm quoting from the declassified version from a commander who said, quote, "It was desirable for there to be a number of fatalities." So although we've been talking about for many, many years now, Jamal, about the atrocities committed by the occupying apartheid Israeli military, their own documents are starting to come to light. In addition, we're going to talk a little bit about the United States, which in terms of foreign policy on Monday revealed a new kind of tranche of sanctions targeting illicit support for the Iranian oil industry. In other words, Iran, much like Russia, has managed to get oil out and into the market. And it looks like the United States is going to crack down on that, which will dim the hopes of the Iran nuclear deal. But before we get to all that, Jamal, we're going to get to a really great interview that you did with Adam Shapiro. He's the director of Israel-Palestine advocacy at Dawn. Dawn has filed a complaint with the Department of Justice basically against 4 lobbyists for the NSO group. We had this discussion and talked about this story last week, who are misrepresenting Israel to it. In other words, they've never registered as lobbyists for a foreign entity. And your interview with Adam was very revealing.
Well, this is, we're going to get the information from someone who conducted the investigation and filed basically the complaint. So let's go to Adam Shapiro. Pegasus, the predator spyware produced by Israel's NSO group, has been exposed infiltrating the private communications devices of lawmakers, politicians, journalists, and activists throughout the world. Israel's government approves the licenses of NSO group to export this technology, which has been widely used by authoritarian governments to repress opposition. NSO group was blacklisted in November 2021 by the United States government for enabling foreign governments to conduct transnational oppression. Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now, a nonprofit organization that promotes democracy, the rule of law, and human rights for all the peoples of the Middle East and North Africa, has filed a complaint with the Department of Justice against 4 lobbyists for NSO group who are misrepresenting Israel's ties to it. Joining us today to discuss this and more, Adam Shapiro, the director of Israel-Palestine advocacy at Dawn. Welcome to Arab Talk, Adam.
Thank you so much for having me and for covering this topic.
So let me start with the basics, actually. Please explain why Pegasus is such a unique, threatening technology and who's behind this NSO group.
So the Pegasus technology, which has now received a lot of attention over the last few years due to its use by authoritarian regimes and others to repress journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers, dissidents. Basically, it can be, there's been a few versions of it, and the most recent version has allowed governments to install the spyware on your device, your phone, and enable that to be activated without you as the user having to touch or press anything on your device. What it will do is allow that the person who's hacking have access to all the files, to the camera, the audio recorder. Basically, it doesn't give the person control over your phone, it gives them access to everything over your phone. And so this is, of course, extremely dangerous. It's a clear privacy violation, but it obviously has put people in danger, including the founder of Dawn, Jamal Khashoggi, who, although we don't know if Pegasus was on his phone, because of course we don't even know where his body is, never mind his phone, we do know that a number of people around him, his close associates and fiancé, did have their devices infiltrated. So this is the kind of danger that the spyware presents. NSO Group was founded by, it's an Israeli company. It was founded by Israelis who had been serving in the what's called Unit 8200, which is the military intelligence unit of the Israeli military, and has become notorious at this point, not only for its own activities that it carries out as the Israeli Army military intelligence unit, but also a lot of the, as we should say, alumni of this unit have gone on to create these cyber companies, which are creating effectively military level technology to be sold on the open market.
So give us a little bit of probably a chronology of the cyber surveillance scandal, which basically exposed the Pegasus project.
So it goes back a few years, actually. One of the first countries in which it got exposed that Pegasus was being used against a human rights activist was the case of Ahmed Mansour in the United Arab Emirates, who was a blogger, an academic, and who, it was later discovered, had found that his phone had been infiltrated by the UAE government using Pegasus spyware, and he is currently in prison and has been sentenced to a long-term prison sentence, effectively for freedom of expression issues. That was one of the first cases of well-documented use of Pegasus spyware. Later on, it came to light that the government of Mexico had acquired and been using Pegasus spyware, and it was used to target, although the government said it was going to be used to target narco traffickers and sort of the bad actors, it ultimately was used against journalists who at the time were critical of the current Mexican government at that time, Enrique Peña Nieto. And we now know that the spyware was likely also used to target the students who were involved with the Ayotzinapa case, which was the case of 47 Mexican students being disappeared and ultimately murdered, to which there's a connection to the former head of Mexican intelligence, who, by the way, is now actually hiding in Israel. So there's a few nefarious cases early on, and then of course what's come to light, and of course the Khashoggi case, and then subsequently what came to light in July 2021 was Amnesty International and The Guardian and New York Times and a number of other media outlets around the world exposing, and Forbidden Stories, exposing what's called the Pegasus Project, which showed that there was a database effectively of about 50,000 phone numbers that had been submitted to NSO for spying, including people like the president of France, President Macron, former US diplomat Rob Malley, who had been working on the Iran nuclear negotiation deal, lots of journalists, lots of human rights activists, lots of lawyers, lots of political dissidents around the world. Not everybody was necessarily targeted, but we don't know that they weren't targeted.
So now the U.S. Department of Commerce has ordered American companies to not sell this technology, citing reports that the group's Pegasus spyware is used against journalists, against, as we said, government officials, activists, and more. In a recent press release, the regulator says that the company is being added to the entity list because its tool threatens, and I'm quoting here, the rules-based international order when it's sold to repressive foreign governments. Maybe you should expand a little bit about this. What is this entity list?
So this is a technical thing. What's really important here is actually the public statement, even more than the listing. The listing is important because this entity list basically means that U.S. companies need a special license in order to sell equipment or software or anything like that to NSO Group. The reality is that NSO Group isn't really buying a lot of stuff from the United States companies. It has its own computers. It develops its own software. It's not, it might be using a cloud server from Amazon, but probably not, given the sensitive nature of the material that it's collecting. So it's somewhat symbolic, but the statement, as you quoted, about the fact that it's, the spyware violates the rules-based order, that it actually went on to say that it's acting in the interest contrary to United States national security and foreign policy. These are very important statements that characterize NSO Group as a nefarious actor in and of itself, separate from the way the governments are using the spyware also. It actually puts the responsibility on the company. And so that was a very important move by the Biden administration and the Department of Commerce, even if the practical effects are somewhat minimal.
So what has Don's investigation revealed?
So our investigation, we were looking at who is lobbying, because we have a project that looks at who is doing the lobbying on behalf of authoritarian and repressive governments and companies and things like that. And as part of our Israel-Palestine work, but also as connects to the work we do on Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other countries, we wanted to see who is who is doing the work for Pegasus, especially after the Commerce Department ruling. And we have found that there are 4 DC-based firms, two very prominent law firms, and then 2 well-known, well-established, more formal lobbying firms that have signed contracts with NSO Group to do the lobbying. And what's interesting about them is that when they submitted their paperwork, they said that this is just a private company.
So wait a minute, I'm sorry to interrupt you here. Yeah. So how is it that an organization can be on the entity list and lobbyists can continue promoting it as though everything is business as usual?
That's a good question. I mean, and that has more to do with the kind of lack of regulatory arrangement around lobbying and all of that. But you could also think of it as like, even the worst criminal gets to have a defense lawyer, right? So if you think of it a little bit in those terms, then it could sort of make sense. Doing lobbying to Congress is not the same as being a defense lawyer in court, but that's kind of the approach that the way lobbying works in the United States, at least. So it is what it is. It needs the lobbying system needs greater reform measures. But in this case, one thing that the Lobbying Registration Act does require is that private companies, foreign companies, disclose, or the lobbyists on their behalf disclose, if there is foreign government control. Now we know, and NSO Group readily tells everybody, that it submits to what's called export regulatory control by the Israeli government. And you can think of export regulatory control as any item that is exported from a country, any country, pharmaceuticals, eggs, meat, clothing, everything you would sell abroad is under export regulatory control to make sure that the products are safe, to make sure that the products meet certain standards, etc. So NSO Group saying that it meets regulatory control is normal, and it doesn't really mean that the government of Israel controls that company or that product from a political standpoint. What the lobbyist registration is trying to tease out and understand and be transparent about is if there is some form of political control by a foreign government, because that would mean that the lobbyists are not just lobbying on behalf of a company, but also on behalf of the political interests of the government.
So who are these lobbyists working for?
So the 4 lobbyists are the law firms are Paul Hastings, Pillsbury Winthrop are the 2 law firms, and then there's a boutique lobbyist firm called Chartwell Strategies, which is headed by a guy who used to head the Trump Victory Fund, and so he's very connected to Republicans. And then there's Blue Light Strategies Group, which is headed by a guy named Steve Rabinowitz, who has a long history on the Democrat side and also lobbying for Israel, pro-Israeli groups and Jewish American groups that are connected to Israel. So there's sort of a covering all their bases in terms of Republican, Democrat, in terms of the Hill administration, and bringing in law firms who have long track records of working on human rights issues and pro bono for social good causes. What we found is that by looking at the open source reporting, and this is really important, it's not that we were able to dig anything up. We just put the pieces together of what's already out there. That through the reporting from the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, Forbidden Stories, lots of other media outlets around the world, including Israeli media outlets, we have shown that the Israeli government, the Israeli Prime Minister's office, especially under Netanyahu, interfered with the either getting contracts for NSO groups, so effectively going to countries and saying, we'll give you, or we'll sell you, the private company will sell you Pegasus spyware if you do X, Y, or Z. Or if you, in the case of Mexico, for instance, what seems to be clear is that Mexico received Pegasus spyware after a visit by Prime Minister Netanyahu to Mexico. And then Mexico changed its 50-year history of voting pattern in the United Nations, voting in favor of resolutions supporting Palestine, to taking a neutral or an abstention or a opposite vote, voting against. There was really no other way to explain that other than the fact that there was a quid pro quo for acquiring Pegasus. Even the Peña Nieto government, before it got Pegasus, was still voting the way Mexico had always voted. So that is a clear, indication that there's a political control. The second major case is that of Saudi Arabia. After the Khashoggi findings came out and the CIA report came out, the Israeli Ministry of Defense regulatory agency actually ordered the termination of the contract and to stop selling Pegasus spyware to the government of Saudi Arabia. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office, Netanyahu himself, came in and personally intervened to make sure that contract didn't stop. So even he overrode the regulatory element of the government, government oversight. And then finally, as we documented and as others documented, Israel refused to sell Pegasus spyware to allow for the sale of Pegasus spyware to Ukraine in the build-up to what ended up being the Russian invasion of that country. And Ukraine was asking for it to help it, with its defensive purposes, basically, to try to understand what was happening with Russian military as it was building up on the border. All of and the reason Israel gave for doing that was because it didn't want to harm relations with Russia. It wasn't about Ukraine's human rights record. It wasn't about how Ukraine might use the spyware to target anybody. It was just simply about preserving the political relationship with Russia. So basically what we found was that these lobbyists, and again, all of this information is open source. It's all widely available. We believe that they intentionally misrepresented the company and that this was done to protect the Israeli government and ultimately to serve the potential sale of this company, which we saw that there a couple of weeks ago, there was a potential sale to an American company. We think this all fits together. So we're asking the Department of Justice to find in our favor, to confirm our investigation. And if they do so, the consequences for the lobbyist firms could be fines, could be some other form of sanction. But more importantly, it changes the way that this company is understood, not just by the media, but by governments. Including, we know that there's already 2 lawsuits, one by Palestinian lawyer Salah Hamouri in France, and another case in Spain that's being investigated right now about NSO Group and the targeting of politicians in Spain. If the Israeli government indeed is found to have political control over this company, then the Israeli government can be brought in as a co-defendant on these cases and any future cases that might be opened in terms of the violations by Pegasus spyware. So that's where, although we're going after a kind of technicality, the potential impact is much greater.
So to be clear, these lobbyists are not registered as foreign agents, right?
They are registered as foreign agents, but only for a private company. And what we're saying is that they didn't disclose that this private company is controlled by a foreign government. And therefore, there are additional transparency requirements that they must report on and register.
So I mean, it seems like all roads lead to Israel, and you have enough evidence to implicate Israel in all of this. With that in mind, what measures has the United States taken in the wake of this?
Well, we did receive a confirmation from the Department of Justice that they are looking into our complaint, which is, I think, really an important first step. We released our complaint a few days before the House Intelligence Committee held a hearing last week, looking at the private commercial sale of spyware, including NSO Group's Pegasus. And we briefed a lot of the members of the committee and their staffs. And I know that they are also taking on board our information and understanding that this is not just a private commercial interest, this is actually a government interest. And any additional steps that the US Congress might take need to be understood in that context and need to be done with that in mind. We know that a number of senators led by Senator Wyden and with Congress members have asked for Magnitsky sanctions against NSO Group. And we are continuing our work to advocate for that, and also to have them ask the Justice Department to, certify our findings.
I mean, I think it should be a major concern, for U.S. officials, and I'm sure you're aware of this. The European Union has recently, we mentioned this, found evidence that smartphones used by some of its staff were compromised by NSO's Pegasus. This is according to the EU's top justice official. It just makes sense if this is happening there. Can we also assume that it is also happening to US officials and their phones are compromised in the United States?
I think that's a very fair assumption. NSO Group has long held that the spyware could not be used against US phone numbers or UK phone numbers. We know that's not true. That's been exposed a number of times now. So there's really no protections regardless of what kind of phone you have or where you're based in the world. What I think is surprising and disappointing at this point is that NSO Group is not the first company, and Pegasus is not the first spyware that came out that could infiltrate people's phones. As far back as 2011, when popular uprisings emerged in the Arab world, at around the same time, we saw governments in the region starting to use tools made by a hacking team, which was an Italian-based company. There were German companies and British companies that were involved with making spyware that was being used to target activists throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Some of those companies have now gone out of business because governments in Europe took steps to start to regulate that industry a bit more. The United States is very far behind. Not that Europe doesn't have more to do, it does. But the United States is really very far behind when it comes to really grappling with the exploitation of this technology, the use of this technology, and its own susceptibility to this technology. I know that there's a lot of desire to come up with like a perfect weapon to use against narco-traffickers and terrorists and child traffickers and all of that. But we have not seen anywhere any evidence that this technology ends up getting used for those purposes. Instead, what we see is that journalists, human rights activists, lawyers, and political dissidents are the ones who get targeted.
I mean, aside from governments or Department of Justice, etc., this is a major concern to carriers, Verizon's, AT&T, smartphone makers such as Apple, etc. Have they been taking any measures to counter this?
Yeah, so we haven't seen it from the carriers per se, but Apple has taken a number of steps, including coming up with greater software solutions basically for your phones to make them more secure. Apple has also created a fund to support the work of groups like Citizen Lab out of the University of Toronto and Amnesty Tech, who are working on uncovering and coming up with solutions for these problems. WhatsApp has brought a lawsuit because its servers were allegedly violated by Pegasus spyware. And that's an important lawsuit that's now part of it being determined in the US Supreme Court, but then we'll go back for a ruling in the US courts. And so we're starting to see some of the companies take action, but it's a slippery slope, right? WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, which is Meta. They're violating our privacy every day. So it's not that all these companies are necessarily our allies entirely when it comes to privacy issues, but on this issue in terms of spyware, they do seem to be our ally, the ally of the consumer. I should also add that another area for engagement, and perhaps some of your listeners or viewers are living in Oregon, for instance, but the state of Oregon State Pension Fund is actually one of the largest investors in a company called Novolpina. Novolpina is one of the owners of NSO Group, one of the prime investment owners of NSO Group. And so there is a campaign underway involving like progressive members in Oregon as well as Palestinian activists there to try to get the Oregon State Fund to disinvest its holdings of Novolpina as a response to this ruling on NSO Group by the Department of Commerce. So that's an important piece that's out there and something that everybody should be looking at there, especially public funds, public investment funds for.
Well, if the government is not going to do something about it, hopefully they'll do something about it. But I don't know if this is your area. I don't know if this is your area of expertise. But what can average people do to protect themselves, or independent journalists, etc., to make sure that they are not being spied on? I mean, do you have any tips for them?
Well, I think there's a number of things that could be done. One is obviously make sure you have, devices that have the latest software upgrades, and are, have the most amounts of security. Use very strong passwords, of course. Basic things like don't click on attachments or links that you're not familiar with, whether they come by text or email or however they come. Use open source technologies for communication. So Signal, which is an alternative to WhatsApp, is a great tool that people can use on their computers, on their phones. It can't stop you from being hacked, but it can encrypt your information when it's being sent. And encrypted information is much more difficult to infiltrate than otherwise. So there are things that can be done, but you should just also be aware and remember, if you've got a phone, somebody potentially could be using it to listen. So, we just need to be more sensible and aware of what we're using and how we're using it.
Adam Shapiro, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
That's the voice and the face of Adam Shapiro. And, here we go again, Jamal. We're in a situation where a lot of these lobbyists are doing the bidding for a foreign entity, lobbying for a foreign, not just any foreign entity and regime, but an apartheid regime, and not declaring themselves as, advocating or lobbying on behalf of a foreign entity and getting away with it. And it's good that they're finally, well, I shouldn't say going to be held accountable, but at least a process will get going to see if we can hold them accountable.
Well, that's the big question, is how much Israel surrogates in Congress are going to hinder any investigations and basically restrict Israeli spyware from infiltrating this country. I mean, I think maybe they learn a lesson from their counterparts at the European Union,
right,
who last week, and we talked about it last week, they've already outed them, saying that now they found out that staff members' phones were hacked,
right.
by this spyware. So I can't imagine if the entire European Union has been infiltrated, that we don't have a similar action happening right here in the United States.
Well, I think that's right, Jamal, and I'm willing to speculate that a number of U.S. officials, elected officials, government leaders have been hacked by this Israeli software. I'm willing to bet anything on it. But here's what I'm also willing to bet. I doubt that the legislature, I doubt that the government, at least the elected officials, will have the backbone or the courage to hold these spies and this spyware accountable. Now, the real wild card is whether or not Merrick Garland's Department of Justice will rise to the occasion. I don't know. I just don't believe that the politicians will take any action. We'll see if the DOJ does.
Yeah, I'm not hopeful, but I'm very happy to see that there is an organization, a credible organization, investigating this, shining the spotlight, filing a complaint, and maybe they'll take some action, and not only put an end to this, but really protect Americans and protect American politicians from this spyware and stop the cover-up for Israel. It's not like we don't have a history of Israeli spies in this country. I mean, they assume that we have forgotten about Jonathan Pollard, Jess.
I haven't forgot about Jonathan Pollard, who caused extreme damage to this country's intelligence services, who's living freely in apartheid regime right now without any accountability in terms
of... He's a hero there, I should say. They celebrate him as a hero.
Right, and let's not forget that it was Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump who managed to secure his release. Among the most notorious spies in U.S. history, spying for the apartheid regime against the U.S. military. It was devastating, and now he's a free man. What
Yeah.
I mean, so can we expect that the elected officials will do anything about this? I don't know.
Hope so. I hope so. We're moving on to the next story, Jess, and this is
Very disturbing. It's
starting from last Friday. I mean, it's not
Right.
news to us, and it's not news to Palestinians who have been crying for help for decades and trying to educate the world about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine that began way before 1948 and continued and still continues on today. But this is a big one. So last Friday, archives of the Israeli occupation forces released through a court document related to the trial of the Israeli soldiers who perpetrated this massacre and brutally slaughtered 49 Palestinians on October 29th of 1956. And of course, the massacre took place in the town of Kafr Qasem. Okay. So just to give some historical background, and then remember, this is shortly after the Nakba and the establishment of the apartheid state of Israel, 1948. So this was the large, big, really ethnic cleansing that happened at the time, and it's a proof that the ethnic cleansing has continued. After 1948, Palestinians who remained on the land and which became Israel at the time, and through all the way to 1967, weren't allowed to travel between their towns and villages without a special military government order. And they had curfews and all kinds of things going on to restrict, at that time, like Israel did not even consider them, they considered them stateless. So they weren't Israeli citizens, even though this is the whole new established states. And these are the ones who managed not to be ethnically cleansed, although actually I should correct that, because many of them got ethnically cleansed from their villages and moved to another Palestinian community within the borders of the newly established state of Israel. 1956 also is, this is on the first day of the Israeli, British, and French invasion of Sinai.
That's right.
And I think also it's referred to as the Triad War, which came in to response because Egypt closed the Suez Canal, and there was this whole plan to really take over the Suez Canal between Israel and the French and the Brits. In fact, this is the one time the United States stopped that from happening. Okay, that's right. That was probably the United States decided to take any serious action against Israel. So 1956, this is at the same day that this was happening, the massacre happened. And now, thankfully, through human rights organizations like B'Tselem and others and many others, they've been trying to navigate the system of the Israeli courts to release these documents. And now we know, because at the time, they couldn't hide this document. They couldn't hide as many. I mean, they couldn't hide this massacre, or deny it, like they've denied what happened in Deir Yassin and others. And you didn't have pictures and photographs and historians. It was too fresh. So Israel actually admitted to it in 1956 and conducted its own investigation. Had at the time, the Brigadier General Iskar Shadmi, who was in charge, he was the commander of the Israeli army and who was put in charge of Kafr Qasem. And I guess at the time, they have this curfew going on, so he had a curfew ordered. But they changed the curfew timing, Jess. So they advanced the curfew. He ordered the curfew to start earlier in the day and ordered his troops to strictly implement it. And, who lived in Kafr Qasem? Qasem, Palestinians, they're farmers, they work the land, they, you know.
Well, he failed to let everybody know that he changed.
Yeah, but worse than this, but also gave a strict order that anyone who remained after the curfew would be shot.
Yeah, with fatalities, as the release documents show. This is deliberate intent shown to commit this slaughter and murder of innocent Palestinian civilians, Jamal. It's in black and white. We've been saying it, and the survivors have been talking about it, but now we have the proof from the apartheid regime itself in their attempt to kind of hide it all these decades. It was planned and it was ordered.
Well, yeah, and then you hear about this. But actually, this is coming from the trial itself, like when they decided. So this, going back to this Shadmi fellow who gave the order. Of course, his troops mercilessly opened fire, killing 49 people, including elderly, women, and children. The massacre was condemned widely, across the globe, even though, things didn't travel, the news didn't travel as fast as now they travel. So Israel was forced basically to conduct an investigation.
Well,
wanted to show
a sham investigation.
Yeah. Well, that's actually, this is the interesting part. And so that's where the transcripts come into play, just because it also, number one, they couldn't deny now, at least now, that this wasn't planned or this was an accident, just like they are trying to play this game now with the murder of journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, that she happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe it's an accident, maybe somebody else shot her. They played this game. They couldn't do that. But they didn't say that this was a specific order. And as you've mentioned earlier, this is, you have a transcript saying, well, it is desirable that there be a number of casualties. I mean, this is from
the commander.
From the commander telling his soldiers. What does that mean?
It means desirable. It means that he ordered that these civilians be murdered. Full stop, Jamal.
And he said, and I'm quoting here, and this commander who was Shmuel Malinki, the one who said it is desirable that there be a number of casualties. He told during the court, he told the court that he answered the soldiers who asked him how they should deal with the Palestinians who did not know about the change in the timing of the curfew, that they should kill them. And he said, and he's the Arabic word, he said, Allah yarhamu, which means in Arabic, may God have mercy on them. In other words, like kill them.
Kill them.
Yeah.
Yeah, kill them.
So there was a systematic plan to basically kill them. But not only this, and then through reading through this, the different testimonials and the transcripts, they had a plan for those who survive. And this is continuing on the plan Dalit of ethnically cleansing the towns and villages.
Right.
I mean, when you see your neighbors and when you see your family members getting slaughtered, so the survivors are going to leave. So he made a plan to kind of leave the boat, because this Kafr Qasem is close to the Jordanian border down. So he made a plan to kind of provide a corridor where he ordered his soldiers not to be there, so people would leave and go across the river. In other words, get rid of them outside the country. So murder as many people as you could, and those who survive, get rid of them.
That's the Israeli playbook, Jamal. We know that playbook. They did it in Deir Yassin. They've done it in other places. They've done it in Kafr Qasem. There's evidence for it. This is exactly the apartheid regime's playbook for ethnic cleansing, Jamal. But my question is, now that we have this data and this information and the documentation of the intention to commit mass murder of civilians, will the accountability, that's a complex question. That's 2-3 generations ago that this occurred, but it's still fresh in the minds of the families of the victims, even from 3 generations ago. So what recourse do you think, or was that talked about at all, in recourse in terms of the families of the survivors of this massacre? What recourse will they have?
What recourse, Jess? We have an American citizen today who got slaughtered, an American citizen who
By a U.S.
his,
bullet.
whose family basically met with the Secretary of State asking to see some justice. And of course, so far they are unable to meet with President Biden.
Right.
And nothing has happened. So you have an American citizen massacred, murdered on camera, where millions of people saw that, sadly, and nothing. So imagine these people from 1956, nothing. There is nothing except we learn more and more about this sad truth until one day, whether through the International Criminal Court or something, and change the sentiment across the globe to start treating Palestinians as human beings instead of burying their heads in the sand and ignoring their plight. And just like quickly,
Jamal,
Jess, the commander, you know what was the commander's punishment? All these people who got arrested, they were like let go in a few days. And the commander's punishment, because you're asking about this, his monetary punishment was equivalent to about 1 cent.
Well, I guess that's the value that the apartheid regime put on innocent, slaughtered Palestinian lives. But I just want to remind the pro-Israel supporters who are listening to our show, there's no statute of limitations.
I'm sorry, I should correct that. The punishment regarding Shadmi, the highest command who gave these orders, the judge ordered him to pay a fine of 10 cents. 10 cents for murdering slaughtering an entire village. And all the officers who spent basically few days time in jail for killing and murdering people, they all had a presidential pardon in Israel.
Well, yeah, well, that's how apartheid regimes and oppressive regimes work, Jamal. We know that. But I want this to be heard very clearly by the supporters of the apartheid regime, which is there's no statute of limitations in terms of accountability at the ICC when it comes to war crimes like this. So, the evidence keeps mounting. I mean, we've been talking about the evidence for these war crimes before the Nakba, during the Nakba, after the Nakba, and on a continuous line until today, Jamal. And we will continue to fight for accountability for all the victims on this show. I know we're not going to let it rest.
No, we won't. And well, at least we know what happened on the inside, because everything is documented.
But how is this any different, Jamal? How is this any different from Deir Yassin? How is this any different from anything else? All the other ethnic cleansing that occurred, from before 1948 up until this day, to the very day that we're doing this show. How is this any different? Of course it's not,
because every year we find out something new. Every year some new documentation gets uncovered.
Yeah, every year. And if an American citizen who's slaughtered by the apartheid regime is not going to get accountability, as you said, there may be people out there who feel maybe there won't be accountability, but history has an interesting way of coming back to haunt perpetrators of massacres and perpetrators of atrocity, and we will not let this story rest. I guarantee that.
You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. We're moving on to the next topic, Jess, and something jumped at me. I don't know if many people noticed it today.
Yeah.
Or paid attention. But first, I start with something like this is the United Nations chief warns humanity, and I'm quoting this, Mr. Gutierrez says that the world facing a threat not seen since the height of the Cold War, and we have been extraordinarily lucky so far. But luck is not a strategy. And then he goes on to say, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. How many people do you think paid attention to this?
Well, less than a handful, to be honest, because people have their minds on other things, unfortunately, and they can't process this. But this was a very dramatic statement made, and if you dig beneath the story a little bit, it's very disturbing.
It's very disturbing, and people should pay close attention to this. And we're going to talk about it here and connect it because, of course, he's referring to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. And then we keep pushing to see this war continue and go on and try to find different confrontations with different countries, which I find it really very provoking that the sad at the same time that the Biden administration, it's almost like is embracing every opportunity to destabilize this world, you know, from Nancy Pelosi's trip initially trying to kind of poke something at the Chinese by going to visit, saying that she wanted to visit Taiwan,
which she will, as it turns out.
To our meddling in this Russia-Ukraine war, and now we're just sitting planning to scrap everything that has all the progress that was made with the with Iran, and trying to kind of hurt Iran in a different way. I mean, here we are complaining about oil prices, and Mr. Biden, President Biden,
that's right,
goes and embraces or fist bumps, let's say, the murderous MBS, so we can get more oil at lower prices. And then here we are trying to find a way to stop Iranians from selling their oil.
That's exactly right, Jamal. And the hypocrisy and the double standard is kind of out there. I want to let our listeners know that, of course, the United States is playing this duplicitous game because, by the way, Russia's doing the same thing, and they're doing nothing to stop the sale of Russian oil on the black market. It's flooding the black market. India and China are buying Russian oil right now. The United States has gone to Venezuela, who is on our terrorist watch list, trying to get the Venezuelans to release and produce more oil that we can import Venezuelan oil, even though they're on the watch list. And yet, Jamal, we're going to punish the Iranians for exporting their oil. And of course, the connection to the apartheid regime should be pretty clear. The Iran nuclear deal, which is celebrated by everybody in the world except the apartheid regime and perhaps MBS, you know, the two thuggish countries in the world right now. This is, you know, at the behest, I believe, and pressure from, I believe, MBS and from the apartheid regime to try to undo all the progress of the Iran nuclear deal and to try to squeeze the Iranians. It's yet another example of a failed foreign policy, Jamal. And who are we doing the bidding for? Let me ask you a question. Is this in the US interest?
It's not. I mean, this is what I've been saying. We've been complaining about oil prices. I mean, they came down since we've been talking about the show a little bit, but they
35 cents.
Where deal. You and I live, they're still hovering around $6. They're like $5.99 a gallon. That's or right. Something like this. Maybe in other states it's a little bit cheaper. I mean, and going back to 2020, you know, we're talking about prices under $4. So that's a lot of money for families who
Absolutely.
Need to commute.
But it's the problem, Jamal, again, of doing a bidding for these rogue medieval apartheid states. So you have the medieval kingdom and the apartheid state. Both these so-called countries have been advocating to put more pressure on Iran, even though it's not in the U.S. interest. Under the Obama administration, Obama said, to heck with you guys, it's in our interest as a country to do the Iran nuclear deal. Of course it is.
It's not in the U.S. interest. It's not in the Europeans' interest. It's not in anyone's interest when at this time, at this day, when we're putting sanctions on Russia and everything has been disrupted, and Iran has been feeling a little bit of that gap. So I'm just like a little bit going to go through this announcement that was made today, Jess. Basically, the United States announcing a new tranche of sanctions targeting, between quotes, illicit support for the Iranian oil industry as prospects for reviving the Iran nuclear deal continue to dim. In his statement, Secretary Blinken said the United States has been sincere in pursuing a path of meaningful diplomacy to achieve a mutual return to full implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the formal name of the 2015, of course, Iran nuclear deal. And he goes on to say, until Iran is ready to return to full implementation of the JCPOA, we will continue to use our sanctions authorities to target exports of petroleum products, and petrochemical products from Iran. I have a question for you, Jess. Listen, we have Israel is not a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and is the only country in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. So when he talks about the rules of law and rules based on international order, because I didn't read his whole statement, it goes something, he continues about the rules based international order. Who does it apply to, those rules?
Well, I think that's exactly right, Jamal. You know, we've been talking about this for so many years now, and we keep asking the same question. In whose strategic interest is it to act this way to support these rogue medieval apartheid countries? I have always, and you have always said, it's not in our long-term strategic interest to support these thuggish regimes, to support these apartheid practices. It just isn't. This is such a great example of clamping down on the Iranian oil export at a time when the economy is teetering globally, and we need, for whatever reason, despite climate change, despite all the other chaos that's going on right now, anything that the United States does to limit the amount of oil that gets produced and distributed globally is only going to hurt the United States. So it seems not just hypocritical, it seems self-destructive to do this policy.
I mean, this takes me back to Gutierrez's statement when he talks about you know, a war, you know, war of annihilation, nuclear annihilation. I mean, when you put sanctions, because I was reading about the sanctions, and it's also sanctions not only on the companies, but also on shipping. So is the United States going to interfere, let's say, in the Gulf area, in the region, to intercept oil tankers? And these oil tankers, what flags are they going to be flying? I'm just making these scenarios. Let's say the United States intercept an oil tanker that with Iranian oil in it, but it was a Russian tanker.
Well,
think of this scenario. I mean, this is very plausible, because now the Russians are collaborating and cooperating with the Iranians. And if we decide to intercept a tanker that's flying a Russian flag, what's going to happen next?
Well, I think, you know, and this gets to this comprehensive analysis we have right now, Jamal, that the United States has thrown the Ukrainian country and the people of Ukraine under the bus. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians are being killed. The entire country is being destroyed. The United States is literally pouring fuel, literally and figuratively pouring fuel on the fire of the destabilization in the region between Russia and Ukraine and the entire region. And, you know, frankly, Jamal, the United States foreign policy and what they're doing to Ukraine right now is so tragic. I come back to this thing that the strategic interests are not being carried out to benefit the United States. It's just not, or the world for that matter.
And not to benefit the Ukrainian people, because they're the ones who are paying with their blood.
The Ukrainians,
except I have to say, for Zelensky and his wife, who managed to pose for Vogue magazine, front page Vogue, when their people are in dire need for clothing and food and shelter, but they had the time to pose for Vogue.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this situation is going to get, it's very shameful. It's only going to get worse. I'm sorry to say this, but this U.S. foreign policy reminds me, Jamal, a little bit of what happened with George Bush and the invasion, the first invasion, the second and the first invasion of Iraq, and the catastrophic consequences that occurred. The unattended, I put that in quotes because I'm not convinced that it's unintended quite yet. But what's happening right now,
with one exception, just I have to say,
yeah,
and Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, as Bush alleged
right.
in his. Now we are poking the Russian bear with nuclear weapons,
and chemical.
Now we're
also
messing around with China. Think about that. That's why I keep going back to that statement by Mr. Guterres about nuclear annihilation, and I'm really concerned about this.
Well, I think you should be concerned. I'm concerned. I'm hoping that our listeners and viewers will be equally concerned. We're going to continue to follow this story because it's all interconnected, and that's one of the things we do on Arab Talk, Jamal. We make the interconnections with all of these political strategies that are not in the best interest of this country, and looking at the consequences.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we will talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.